Have you ever wished you could turn back time? Or skip forward years ahead? Found yourself frustrated that it's just the stuff of sci-fi legend? Well, perhaps there's more truth to time travel than you might previously have thought, and you won't need a police box that's bigger on the outside. Here's top 5 scary time travel stories you would not believe. And where would you travel to in time? Let us know in the comments. Number 5. Victor Goddard. Royal Air Force Commander Victor Goddard was a flying ace who served with the RAF in the First and Second World Wars, who seemed to be a vessel for paranormal activity. In 1935, during action in the Second World War, Sir Goddard was sent to investigate the condition of an abandoned Scottish airfield in the unnotable village of Drem, east of Edinburgh. When Goddard flew over the field, he reported it as they'd expected, that it was as they described, a desolate, abandoned airfield where the cows were grazing on grass that had forced itself through. As he circled the airfield, however, he found himself caught in a storm cloud that had been passing overhead and had to fight to regain control. When exiting the cloud, Goddard found himself frozen in fear, looking down and reporting that the airfield had been completely repaired. The airbase had been restored, now fueling and stocking 4 biplanes in its hangar. The abandoned field was now crewed by a staff of mechanics, all dressed in blue coveralls, unlike the RAF at the time, which would have worn brown uniforms. The planes on the field too had been painted a bright yellow, contrasting with the usual drab silver of the RAF at the time. The storm cloud passed through again, and Goddard reported it vanished yet again. Had he passed through a temporal loop? Was there something more in that storm? Most concerningly and most interestingly, in 1939 the airfield at Drem was restored completely to working order. And shockingly, the RAF mechanic uniforms were updated to be blue coveralls and the planes started to be painted yellow, as if for a moment Goddard had seen years into the future. The incident haunted Goddard, and he wrote about his experiences in his book Flight Towards Reality, where he tried to make some sense of his brief flight through time. Number 4. Mike Markum. In 1995, Mike Markum was a 21-year-old student majoring in electricity with a knack for homemade gadgets. His goal? To create a time machine out of scraps in his home in Missouri. The device, which he had dubbed Jacob's Ladder, referring to the biblical ladder to the heaven, and less likely the fantastic 90s horror film, was constructed using the laser from a compact disc player and a continuous arc between 2 poles. And you know what, if I'm being honest, I'm more of a Morty than I am a Rick. I got no idea how he built this and I got no idea what it does, but he says it would help him travel through time. Markum claimed that his device produced such energy that when he threw a piece of sheet metal into it, it disappeared and reappeared seconds later. Hoping to see what he could do with some real power, Markum stole 6 transformers from a power grid nearby. His next experiment caused a blackout in the neighborhood, and his theft alerted the local police. Markum spent the next few months in jail, but upon his release was stunned to discover that he'd become a bit of a local hero. After an interview on a radio station, calls were pouring in from people who wanted to donate money, supplies, and their own ideas on how to help Markum with his time travel device. For the next 2 years, Markum would work tirelessly on his machine, having rebuilt the plans to be the size of a man. 1997 would be the last update from Mike Markum, who vanished from the public eye and the world at large, with his whereabouts being unknown since then. After missing a call from his parole officer, police tried to track Markum down, going to the warehouse he used as a workshop, finding nothing but burned up machines, damaged electronics, and no sign of life at all. Did Markum's machine work? Well, we may never know unless he decides to come back. Or forward. Number 3. Anne Mobery and Elle Jourdan. In 1901, 2 friends and collegiates, Anne Mobery and Eleanor Jourdan, were both teachers at St. Hugh's College in Oxford who were traveling through France on a vacation. Their primary destination was the Palace of Versailles, the former center of political power in France until the Revolution. What was supposed to be a walk through the annals of history became far more literal than either of the women would expect. Taking a promenade through the Petit Trianon, the two claimed to have found themselves walking through the 17th century, surrounded by people in period attire, going about their day as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Jourdan claimed that it was as if they'd seen they were walking through a painting, that it felt as if they were in a living tableau. As they walked through, confused and disoriented, they came forward to a woman sketching in the park who they assumed to be another tourist, who they later claimed was Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France. Shortly after, the pair found themselves back in the palace as if nothing had happened. They had returned and visited Petit Trianon several times, hoping to reignite whatever had occurred. When they returned to Oxford, they produced 2 separate personal accounts of what had occurred, desperate for answers. In 1911, the two produced a book called An Adventure, under pen names for fear their academic status would be threatened. The two never found answers for what happened to them and were often ridiculed for their belief, their claims being dismissed as a shared delusion, a folie à deux, or nothing more than a tall tale for attention, which seems unlikely from two esteemed teachers. So what really happened then? Did Anne Mobery and Eleanor Jourdan share a hallucination on a trip together? Or did they accidentally walk through time and find themselves in another world, if even for a moment? Number 2. Breaking a story 10 years before it happens. In 1932, a pair of newspaper reporters, J. Bernard Hutton and photojournalist Joachim Brandt, had been assigned to cover a story on the shipyard in Hamburg, Germany. Not the most exciting gig, but hey, sometimes that's being a newspaper reporter. The men drove out to the yard, questioned the workers, spoke to the executives, and had finished everything they were sent out to do by about the middle of the afternoon. Presumably bored out of their minds having to document all the excitement of a 1930s shipyard, the men were rattled to hear the screech of aircraft flying up ahead, and found themselves surrounded by warplanes circling around. The workers were fleeing, and the two journalists tried to flee the scene as quickly as possible, making sure to take several photos to take back to the newspaper as proof of an attack, finding it a much more compelling story than what they'd originally been asked to cover. The security personnel insisted the men had to evacuate as soon as possible. The men fled, saving themselves by a hair. But as they escaped the facility, they found something far more disconcerting. The skies of Hamburg were clear. There was no black smoke, no damage, no warplanes, no panic. The men didn't understand. It was as if the battle lasted for seconds. When Brandt developed his photographs, shockingly, it depicted the shipyard as they'd seen it that morning, completely intact. The editor dismissed all of their claims as a farce, assuming his reporters had just stopped to try some local drinks and came up with a wild story. The two never spoke of the incident again. Until in 1943, a story came out about a Royal Air Force raid on a Hamburg shipyard. It was exactly as the men had described to the detail, 11 years after they had seen it. Number 1, the Philadelphia experiment. If there is any one body on the planet that I am easily convinced has a leg up on time travel, it is the US government. In 1943, the US Navy were attempting to experiment with cloaking technology to be able to render something invisible, with their ultimate goal being a full warship. The USS Eldridge was the subject of these experiments. The experiment was to create a high voltage magnetic field around the ship in order to cloak it or something. Again, I'm a host for a YouTube channel. I am the farthest thing from a scientist. The story goes here that the ship vanished, surrounded by a cloud of green smoke. The crew of the Eldridge complained of severe nausea, several of them complaining of mental breakdowns, extreme mood swings, and disorders after the experiment. Some claim to have even been rematerialized, fused into the bulkheads. Of course, everything about the Philadelphia experiment is as classified can get, documents full of blacked out redacted chunks, so we only have the reports of individual crew members to go off of. One service member from the ship, Elle, claims that the invisibility cloak was all a front, and the true experiment was to travel through time, claiming that for moments the ship had traveled 100 years into the future, but what felt like for only 10 seconds. Now, some of Bialik's claims get a bit out there, difficult to follow, but bear with us because they're interesting to listen to. Bialik claimed that the world of the future was a unified utopia of floating cities and clouds, in a world without governments being ran by a hyper-intelligent AI called the Synthetic Intelligence Computer System. War and all its conflicts had become a thing of the past. Bialik went on to claim that he was involved in the Montauk Project as well, a conspiracy theory that alleges, as part of the MK Ultra experiments, the US Army was attempting to research psychological warfare and time travel. Now, obviously, the US government did not acknowledge or give the time of day to any of Bialik's claims, but I mean, why would they? They're not going to come out and say, yeah, you got us. Hands up, we've been experimenting with time travel and this guy is blowing the entire thing for us. Or would they just stand by, say nothing, smile, and just insist that we're all just tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists? That's all from me today, my ghouls and goblins. Thank you so much. I've been Taylor. Keep watching for more top 5 scary videos.